I can't smile without you. Can't smile without you. If you only knew what I'm going through, I just can't smile without you. I warned you.
Did you hear that?
Yeah, okay.
That remark?
Well, no, what?
Did somebody turn him off?
Yeah.
Logged him off?
Hey, Cheryl Wayne, could you pass these out? I think we got enough now. You can give one to everybody. We've got plenty of those. Well, thank you for coming back. And I hope that you are maybe becoming some better aware of some things that are very practical, very personal, and can be very helpful to you and to you to help other people. You know, one thing I think that's really important whenever we're struggling with a really difficult time in our life, and most of the troubles we have in life are some form of loss. Most of the troubles that we have in life are some form of loss. We need to be patient with ourselves. We need to realize that we have a thinker and a feeler, and when we're going through a difficult time, our thinker and our feeler are not always on the same page. They're not even in the same book sometimes. We can really struggle with a lot of internal confliction. And we just need to realize we're not going to be our normal. Whenever we're in that neutral zone period, we are not going to be normal. What we need to realize is we need to keep working on living and not just existing. One of the mottos of the Widowhood Workshop Ministry is there in the front of the auditorium, at the very top of that banner, it says, "Don't die until you're dead," until you're dead. Sometimes when somebody dies in our life, we feel dead. We may want to be dead. We may even have suicidal thoughts. But don't die until you're dead. Let's not just choose to exist. Let's choose to live. Now, what I'm going to do in this session is I'm going to explain to you a little bit about where the Widowhood Workshop Ministry got started. I'm going to share with you some information about widowhood before we get into biblical things. The baby that became my wife was born in Dover, Ohio, which is about an hour south of Cleveland, Ohio. And we met when I was 15 years old, and for the first time in my life started going to church. My dad was an unfaithful Christian my entire life until I was about 15. He decided to come back to the Lord. I'd never read the Bible, never went to church. And he decided that he was going to come back to the Lord. His family was going to be a church-going family. And frankly, because I didn't know anything about the Bible, I didn't know anything about the Lord, I really wasn't that excited about this experience. But there was a 15-year-old girl there that caused me to be interested in going to church. And over the course of about 4 years, I became very attached to her, intentionally attached to her. And we got married. After my freshman year at Freed-Hardeman College, it was called at that time, we got married, and I came back to school as a full-time student, and she worked full-time to get us through those first few years. We were blessed with 3 daughters, and those 3 daughters were raised right. If you see in the lower right-hand corner there, the shirts that they have on say God first, then family, then the Ohio State Buckeyes. They all grew up in Ohio. They are all 3 faithful members of the church. They're married to Christian husbands. They are, as couples, very involved in the Lord's church. One lives in Laverne, Tennessee, Smyrna, Tennessee. She goes to church in Laverne, Tennessee. That's the congregation that oversees the Widowhood Workshop Ministry. And then I have a daughter in Gainesville, Florida, who is a member at the University City Church in Gainesville, Florida. And then I have another daughter whose husband is an elder in the Lord's church in Villa Rica, Georgia, which is where I live, about 40 miles west of Atlanta. I shouldn't say I live there. That's where my address is. That's where my mail goes. I'm on the road most of the time. but we're really proud of those kids, those daughters. We were blessed with 5 grandchildren. This picture was taken about 18 months after my wife passed away, and that's where she's buried, on a hill in the same city where she was born and the same city where she graduated from high school. Can you imagine having a small grandchild of yours put in the hospital bed where you were laying in your house and not even have the ability to raise your arms to hug that child? Speaking of blessings, have you ever thanked the Lord for the ability to hug? Put that on your list. We have a multitude of blessings that we have never, ever thanked the Lord for. When I brought her home from the hospital on July the 14th of 2013, I was standing in front of the stove, and I had a come to Jesus meeting. Something dawned on me. See, on July 11th, my wife was starving to death, and I'm saying literally, she was starving to death. The Parkinson's disease had stolen from her the ability to talk, the ability to swallow, the ability to eat. And finally, she consented to having a feeding tube put in that night, July 11, 2013. I brought her home on July 14th of 2013, and I was standing in front of the stove, and I thought, all the years that I have thanked the Lord for the food before we would eat together, I never thanked Him for the ability to eat. Have you ever thanked the Lord for the ability to eat? She was deprived of that ability. I fed her through a feeding tube. And I made a commitment that day to not bring any food into the house that she would smell, because she couldn't eat. A lot of times now, when I thank the Lord for the food that I'm about to eat, I thank the Lord for the ability to eat. I thank the Lord for the ability to taste. Do you know there are people who eat based on texture, not taste? I had a brother who fell down the steps into his basement, and a consequence of that experience was he lost his sense of taste. Everything he eats is based on texture, not on taste. You ever thank the Lord for the ability to taste? Count your many blessings. Name them one by one. It will surprise you what the Lord's done. She died on Christmas morning of 2013 at 9:40 in the morning. And I began my journey as a widower. I'll say it again. I think I've already said it once. I hate widowhood with a passion. I love being married. I hate widowhood. Like a cancer patient would say that about their cancer. I hate cancer. So you can hate a circumstance in your life, but still love your life because you're so richly blessed by God. But there are some things that we can experience in life that we can honestly say that we hate. The middle of January of 2014, about 3 weeks after my wife was buried, I started searching for help for widowed people, especially ministries to help widowed people. And guess what I found? Virtually nothing. It struck me then. I'd never thought about this before. It struck me then. Here I'd been a preacher for decades. At that point, I'd been with this church for 32 years. Why had I never, ever thought about starting a widowhood ministry? Then I started searching for things, and I thought, well, if there isn't much, then we can start something. And it's my family's passion project. My 3 daughters, my 3 sons-in-law, my 5 grandchildren, they are all involved in this ministry. They all have responsibilities. This picture was taken in July, just this past July. My family hosts a nationwide widowhood retreat every year in the month of July. Because it dawned on me, if we have youth camps for kids, we have marriage and family retreats and seminars, we have senior citizen days, why don't we have a retreat for widowed people? And so this past July was the 6th year. And this past July, we had 158 widowed people there from 15 different states. We've had them fly in from the state of Washington, Southern California, Florida, Michigan. I even let people from Michigan come, and I'm from Ohio. That is not what most people would do, but it is my family's passion project. The reason why it's called Widowhood Workshop is because the loss of a spouse is for most people, but not all, but for most people, it is their greatest loss. And so the workshops we do raise awareness about grief, help to educate people about loss and its impact, help them to negotiate that stormy time in their life, and encourage them to use their loss for the glory of God by helping other people. Now, what we're going to be talking about is the loss of your mate by death. And I'm going to share with you some things I'm sure you're not familiar with. A third of the population, 65 years and older, are widowed. About 6% generally of the population is widowed. So, if you're widowed, you are a minority. Now, if you look at the 65 years and up, way over a third of the women, 65 years and older, are widowed. 12% of the men, 65 years and older, are widowed. Now, watch when you drop that number down to 55. Almost a third of the women, 55 years and older, are widowed. 9% of the men, 55 years and older, are widowed. Now, let me ask you a question. If you were to think about what decade of life would there be a lot of people losing their spouse, what decade would that be? It wouldn't be the teens, it wouldn't be the 20s. What decade would you choose to think that there'd be a whole lot of people lose their spouse? What decade? 70s, yeah, boy. 70s, if you were married maybe in your 20s, you probably were married maybe for 45 or maybe 50 plus years. Do you know what the average age of a woman is when she's first widowed in our country? Now, the average age is 57. If there are so many people, and there are so many women in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s losing their mate, how in the world could the average age when a woman is first widowed be that low of 57? Well, you'd have to have a boatload of people, women in their 20s and 30s and 40s, to lose their spouses to drive that number down to 57. And I will say this, the most inspiring people I've met since my family launched this ministry are young ladies in their 20s and 30s and early 40s who've lost their husbands. They are amazing. They are just amazing. I wish there was a bus parked out there in the parking lot and we could board the bus and we'd go to West Tennessee and visit Brittany. Brittany was married to Bradford for 1,300 days. I know that because I read her blog she wrote on her grief journey. Her husband was skilled in helping kids. She was waking up that morning married, and her husband went up to Trenton, Tennessee to help some kids, and he was in a fatal car accident. After 1,300 days of marriage, she's widowed. We could get back on that bus and we could go up a little further north than that, and I could introduce you to Cynthia. 29 years old, her husband 29 years old, they have 3 kids. They're big farmers in West Tennessee. One day he went out and cranked up his welder. They had a lot of agriculture. It was October. The cotton was getting white in the fields, and he went out in the shed to crank up the welder, and he was going to weld on this truck that had a diesel tank on the back that had 75% diesel fuel in it and 25% fumes, which was not a problem, but what he did not know was that tank had a pinhole leak in it. And when he cranked up that welder, it blew that building up and blew his body out of the building. Cynthia ran and got a whole bunch of comforters and blankets wet in the bathtub, went out and threw them on her husband's body. He was life-flighted to Memphis and died about 48 hours later. She's 29 years old, has 3 kids, and the crop is in the field. How in the world? We could go a little further north to western Kentucky, and I could introduce you to Tandy. Tandy is a young lady who was happily married, and she came home one day just like she always did. And when she entered the house, she put her purse on the washer and the dryer, and she walked down the hall and found her husband in a pool of blood and the gun right there beside him. We could go to Southwest Georgia on that bus trip, and we could visit Buffy. She was a young lady who had a son about a year old. And every day at work, she was a teacher in a faith-based school. And one day she hung up, concerned about the conversation. She went to the car and decided to drive home, but it was a 45-minute commute to go home. On the way to her house, she called her father, who was a law enforcement officer, and said, "Dad, would you go to the house? I'm concerned about him." And I'm glad her father got there first, because he'd taken his life too. There's an old book that's titled with this question: must the young die too? The young do die too. The thing that you have to experience first before you're at risk of being widowed is you have to say, "I do." And it never dawned on me when I was married. That whole time I was a prospective widowed person. Never thought about it. Never crossed my mind. Now, there are a whole lot more women that are widowed than men, and let me explain to you two facts, and I'll give you my personal perspective on those two facts. The lifespan of a woman is longer than the lifespan of a man. Now, guys, that's our fault. The only rationale that I have for explaining that is we take such good care of you women. You live longer than we do, okay? There are 4 to 5 times more widowed females than there are widowed males. Now, the second fact I'm going to share with you is women statistically have a habit of marrying men who are older than they are. That is the fault of the female gender. If the lifespan of a woman is longer than the lifespan of a man, and then a woman is going to marry a man who's older than she is far more likely to be widowed than he is. But there are exceptions. There are men sitting in this room, and I'm standing here, proof of the fact that it could happen to a man too. And I will say this: I'm glad my wife went first. The 10th anniversary of her death will be Christmas this year for me. I would have never wanted her to have experienced this. As strange as it may sound to some of you, I'm glad she went first. I wouldn't have wanted her to deal with being widowed. There are 15 million plus widowed people in our country. And I just wonder who's ministering to these people who are experiencing life after horrific loss in their life. There are over 1 million people annually who lose a spouse. 6% of them are under 44 years old. What are we doing to help these people? 78% of the widowed are women. Have you ever wondered how many widowed people there are where you live? There is a resource that I go to study a place before I go there. I've studied Dripping Springs, Texas. The website is called censusreporter.org. It's very informative. Dripping Springs, Texas. The sign as you drive into town is inaccurate, but about the population, I think it says 1,788. It's way more than that. Dripping Springs, Texas, 4,699. 4,699. There are a little over 1,600 households. Of those almost 1,700 households, 9% of them are female householders. That means there's not an adult male living in that house. 9%. So there are a lot of either never married females, divorced females, and widowed females who are female householders. 9% of all of the nearly 1,700 households, female householders. Now, if you were to get all of the females in Dripping Springs, Texas together who are 15 years and older. Now, don't ask me why, because I don't know. The Census Bureau considers a 15-year-old an adult, but they do, okay? If you were to get all of the 15-year-old and older females in Dripping Springs, Texas together, 11% of them are widowed. 11%. Now, if there was some way, I wish there was some way that I could accurately kick that number from 15 years and older to 20 years and older. Imagine how much higher that percentage would be than 11%. It would be way higher than 11%. Hopefully, those 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old girls are not married. 1% of the men, 15 years and older, are widowed. Bottom line is, if you do a conservative guesstimate on the females 15 years and older based on the total population, in Dripping Springs, Texas, there are probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 widowed females and males. At least 250 in Dripping Springs, Texas. Hays County, population, 269,000 plus. 5% of the females in Hays County, Texas, 5% are female, widowed, 5%. That means somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000, based on that much higher percentage. Probably 700 men in Hays County are widowed. So we're talking about probably over 5,700 widowed people in Hays County, Texas. Anybody ministering to them? Anybody reaching out to them? Anybody attempting to show compassion and provide encouragement and maybe introducing them to Jesus and His church? One of the things in that stapled information that you got, there is a little article there about widowhood fellowships. And one of the things that my family's Passion Project does is we help churches start local ongoing widowhood ministries. Because the thing that we need most whenever we're struggling isn't just the building of our social network, but a closer walk with Jesus. And maybe an introduction to His church. Most of the research done about widowhood is done from a female perspective, and that's because there are just a lot more female folks who are widowed than males. There are 245 million widowed people, females, in our world. 115 million of them live in abject poverty. One of the most touching articles I've ever read in my life, National Geographic, February of 2017. There's a lengthy article in here about the widowed females in India. When you read this article, you'll probably wonder like me, surely people are not treated like that in our modern day world. It's terrible. Are we encouraging our missionaries who are all over the world to make it a point to engage those churches they are planting in widowhood ministry? One of the things that we're proud of with my family's Passion Project is we have been helping periodically Joseph Eshan in Ghana, who wanted to start a local ongoing widowhood ministry. And in the first year of that local ministry, he had about 8 or 9 people become Christians because of his outreach. Now, I want to ask you to think about what the Bible says, what God says in His book about him and the widowed. And I want to ask you about him describing himself as a defender, a reliever, and a protector of the widowed. What does that tell you about God and the widowed? Anybody? What does it tell you about God and the widowed? Go ahead. He cares about them, okay? Now, what arouses our care for somebody else? What kind of stimulates our care, raises our level of care? What do we find out? They're going through something that causes us to have this concern. A mixture of mental and emotional reaction to what we see or hear about somebody else experiencing. So God cares, right? Does God know what a person's going through? Every single one of us. He knows what's going on around us. He knows what's going on inside of us. He cares. Now, He cares. Now, how does He do this? He identifies Himself as a defender, a reliever, and a protector of the widowed. How does He do it? Have you ever thought about that? Well, no doubt His book is a great help, a great source of hope and encouragement and a great source of confidence building in a terribly difficult, challenging time of life. But what about us? Have you ever sung that song? Probably you'd have to be an old geezer like me if you have. Have you ever sung that song about the world's Bible? He has no hands but our hands to do his work today. He has no feet but our feet. Sometimes God's best work is done through his people. But if his people don't know what somebody else is going through, that individual in need is not going to receive the right kind of help. We need to know, and we need to be compassionate. And when we know that somebody is going through a difficult time, and we have compassion, then we are just like Jesus. We are moved with compassion to do something to be of help. One reason why the widowed people and other people who've suffered great loss, child, grandchild, parent, a lot of times the reason why they're neglected isn't because of a lack of compassion. It's a lack of knowledge. They just don't know what it's like. But you're going to find out about what it's like in the next session. The wicked slay the widow. See, the wicked don't care. They don't have a heart of compassion. And Job's friends, one of Job's friends went so far as to suggest that the reason why he was suffering was he sent widows away empty. Job didn't care about the widowed. I seriously doubt that indictment was accurate, but that was the claim. Now, I find it interesting in Deuteronomy chapter 24, at this particular time in Israel's history, they are getting ready to cross the Jordan River. They're going to go into the land of Canaan, and they're going to conquer the land of Canaan. And those people living there are barbaric heathen people. Now, what I would have done if I was God, and it's a good thing for the Israelites, I was not at this time, nor am I now, I would have sent Moses an email or a map through the post office. And I would have said, Moses, give this to Joshua. When you cross the river, here's where you set up the people, and then here are the rules of engagement when we cross the river. I would have prepped them for military engagement. You know, there are rules of engagement in battle. God doesn't do that. Instead of talking about rules of engagement at this juncture, notice what he talks about. Deuteronomy 24, starting in verse 17. You shall not pervert justice, do the stranger or fatherless, nor take a widow's garment as a pledge. Here are three life circumstances that are mentioned here. Notice there's nothing here about military engagement. Stranger, fatherless, widow. Those are three life circumstances. What is similar about those three? What's the common thread? There's more than one, really, but what is one that you would suggest? Okay, they're in need, aren't they? They have a unique need in their life circumstances. These three circumstances are often mentioned in the Bible together, sometimes two of the three. So he says, the stranger, the fatherless, and don't take a widow's garment for a pledge. But you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I command you to do this thing. Why would he remind them about Egypt? When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back and get it. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive tree, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather your grapes of the vineyard, you shall not go back and glean it afterward. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. And again, a second time, and you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command you to do this thing. Why does he bring up Egypt? What was their life like? Give me a word to describe it. Powerless. Difficult, burdened. They were in slavery. They cried out to the Lord. The Lord didn't just hear their call. The Lord, in a timely fashion, responded to that call. He made things happen. He brought them out of Egypt. What did that show you? It showed you not only his power, but his compassion. He brings up their time in Egypt and him releasing them from that bondage twice to basically tell them, you be to these people like I was to you when you were in Egypt. Compassion. Sadly, we don't have the time to look at it. In Isaiah chapter 1, you'll see that they didn't listen. And they are reproved when God sends Isaiah to them because they did not plead for the widow. They did not take into account the timely and difficult circumstances of the widowed. God wanted them to be compassionate. Do you know what God always wants of us? He wants of us to have passion for Him and compassion for people. Whether you're talking about the Old Testament or you're talking about the New Testament, right religion has always been about basically two things: passion for God and compassion for people. In the New Testament, you read about the Pharisees and other Jewish leaders who became passionate about their rituals. They weren't passionate for God, they were passionate about their rituals. And Jesus got in their face and reproved them for that. Passion for God and compassion for people has always been what God has wanted of us. But we're not going to show that compassion if we don't know what somebody else is going through. Yes, sir.
James 1:27.
Oh, well, looky here. We're going to get to that. Hang on. James 1 and verse 27. Let's go to it right now. Okay, now, I'm sure that some of you went to English class, and so I'm going to have you go back to English class, which for some of you is probably a nightmare. I want you to look at this sentence in front of you now, and I want you to identify the subject of the sentence. No modifiers, just the subject. No modifiers, just the subject. Remember, subject, verb, they're sometimes objects of verbs, they're adjectives and adverbs. I'm just looking for the subject. What's the subject of that sentence? Religion. Now, what are the modifiers? Because this is not just talking about any religion. Okay, pure and undefiled. Now, logically, if he identifies pure and undefiled religion, what does that tell you about religion? There's also impure and defiled religion. Here's something that our culture does not understand but needs to be told. Not all religion is right in the sight of God, period. That's not a debatable subject. That's just the way it is. Right religion in the sight of God. Not in the sight of the Pope, not in the sight of a synod or a council or a preacher. This is right religion in the sight of God. Now, there are three verbs in this sentence. Who can identify? Give me a verb. Is. Give me another one. Keep. Give me another one. Did y'all skip English class? There's one in the middle between is and keep. Visit. Yeah, visit. Okay, now, we're going to observe the Passover on is, okay? We're going to go and focus on these other two. Let's look at the last one first, keep. Now, if you have passion for God, holy God. I love reading Isaiah 6. I'll tell you, when you get kind of depressed and discouraged about the world we live in and maybe about your spiritual life yourself and the things you're going through, Isaiah chapter 6 is so inspiring. Isaiah gets to experience this unique vision of seeing the Lord on the throne and then hearing these words. And I can't help but wonder what the voice sounded like. Holy, holy, holy. It had a tremendous effect on him. He realized he was such a sinner. He was in a sinful nation. But he was so impressed with the holiness of God. You know, when we have a passion for a holy God, we want to keep ourselves unspotted from the world. Right religion, first and foremost, is about passion for God, unparalleled passion for God. That's going to help us to have a determination to keep ourselves. By the way, it's keep on keeping yourselves is the idea. It's in the present tense. You keep on keeping yourself unspotted from the world. That's a part of right religion, but it's not the only part, because there's that other verb up there, visit. Now, that word visit, the Greek word for that word that's translated visit, if you were to see the Greek word for the word bishop, and then the Greek word for the word visit, you'd think those look kind of similar, and they are. A bishop is an overseer. Now, this word has to do with basically looking over and inspecting, overseeing a situation to find out what's going on, and then you address the need. A.T. Robertson said it's a common verb to go and see, to inspect. It's present tense for the habit or practice of doing that. So in other words, what you're doing is you're finding out about the needs of a person or a situation, and then you address those needs. That's visiting in the Bible. Matthew chapter 25 talks about visiting. Here, James 1:27, visit. Now, there are two objects of that verb. What's the two objects of that one verb? Okay, orphans and widows. Now, in regard to the orphans, or fatherless, depending on your translation, what have we done in the church? What have we done for orphan children? We have children's homes all over. I saw, is it Mountain State? Okay, Mountain State. You could go to Valparaiso, Indiana, you could find Schultz Lewis Children's Home. You could go to north of Cincinnati and there's Midwestern Children's Home. You could go down to Bowling Green, Kentucky, and there's Potter Children's Home. You could go down to the state of Tennessee, Tennessee Children's Home. They have a West Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, East Tennessee campus. You could go down around Huntsville and you could go to the North Alabama Children's Homes. We have children's homes all over the place. Where we have planted churches in other countries, we have started children's homes. And the ones we have in our country are not really technically orphans' homes. They're children's homes, and we're servicing the needs of vulnerable kids who are at risk because things are not right, even in their life or in their family's life. A lot of the kids that now we are servicing, we're visiting through our children's homes, are kids who are from dysfunctional families. Some of them have very serious personal problems. Some of them are in need of a lot of counseling. And what we're doing is we're basically taking them in and trying to care for them. Some instances, we're trying to get them back to their families eventually. But we're ministering to children in need, and that's a great thing. You know, one thing I think that we need to do also in regard to children is we need to, in the church, we need to encourage foster parents. Do you know of anybody here that's a foster parent? That's a great ministry. Why do those kids are vulnerable. They have needs. Foster parenting is a great ministry. I know a guy up in Ohio, outside of Canton, Ohio. He's in his 40s, mid-40s, I would say. And a little over a year ago, his wife went and took a nap and never woke up. They took 4 children into their home, foster children, special needs children. 4 children with special needs. They took them into their home. He's a widower now. They had a heart for kids. You know what I think we ought to do in regard to adoption? When I did a little bit, and I've done very little, when I've done a little bit of research about adoption, and I found out how expensive it is, I have something that I would really encourage any church to do. If there is a couple interested in adopting children, why shouldn't God's family pick up the entire tab? You're talking thousands of dollars. If we have parents who are interested in helping special situations like this, kids who are in need, why can't God's family pick up the tab and they, as a couple, are investing their lives into a great ministry? The point is, we need to be compassionate toward kids who need help. And I think that we have done that. Now, we've not done it perfectly. But now, wait a minute, there's a second object of the same verb. What's the second object of the same verb? What have we done in the church that is anywhere near comparison to the effort that we put into caring for vulnerable children. There is no comparison, is there? See, that never dawned on me until after my wife died. Never dawned on me. I loved those widowed people in that church. I was number 12, by the way. That middle January night of 2014, after doing some research, I got the pictorial directory out, and I started flipping through the pictorial directory with a little yellow pad and a pen, and I started writing down the name of every widowed person in the church. Now, I'd been at that church for 32 years. I'd never done that before. 8 females. I was the 4th male. I was number 12. If you'd come and asked me about how many kids do you have in that church where you preach in Hartville, Ohio, I could have gone to the computer and kicked out a list of every kid, where they went to school, what their age was, the year they were going to graduate. But if you'd asked me how many widowed people are in the church where you preach, I couldn't have answered that question till after my wife died. Do you know most churches do not know? I've asked, how many widowed people do you have in your church? Most churches do not know how many widowed people they have. We have all contributed. We have all been neglectful in maybe a number of areas. One of the things that I periodically ask God to forgive me of is my neglect. Because I know, we all drop the ball. None of us are perfect. In Acts chapter 6, another passage about this subject. In Acts chapter 6 and verse 1, now in those days when the number of the disciples was multiplying, there arose a complaint against the Hebrews by the Hellenists because their widows were neglected in the daily distribution. Even in the first century church, there was neglect of the widowed. Now, Wayne Jackson, in his commentary on the book of Acts, said by the time that you get to Acts chapter 6, what you're dealing with, he said, is very likely a church probably in the number of 20,000. Can you imagine being a member of a church of 20,000? I'll be honest with you, I wouldn't want to be a preacher of a church of 20,000. Because you know what you've got when you've got 20,000 people together? You got a mass of a mess. Because you know what? Every single one of us have baggage. You can't see it, but everybody has baggage. Some of us have been carrying baggage from way back years in our life. Some of us recently acquired baggage, but everybody has baggage. And we can be just such a mess. By the way, it's okay to let other people know you're not okay. It really is. Because you know what? The person that you admit to that you're not okay probably is not okay either. They probably have stuff going on in their life too. But boy, we can sometimes in our culture nowadays, we can be private to a fault. And we have a hard time admitting the fact that things aren't going too well. Well, imagine 20,000 people. Some of these people, a lot of these people came from all over the inhabited world. They came, Acts chapter 2, the day of Pentecost, you've got all those Jews from all over the place. Now, they come for a designated period of time because that's the way they've been rolling for years. But this is going to be a different day of Pentecost. The church is birthed. They become Christians and they end up staying way longer than they had anticipated. Have you ever planned to go somewhere and something happened that you ended up having to stay way longer than you planned? Now imagine 20,000 people. Now imagine the ministry needs as the church is growing so rapidly. Imagine the ministry needs as these people had come from all over the place. They're staying there way longer than they anticipated. Imagine the logistical nightmare of ministering to those people. The first ministry weakness in the church mentioned in the Bible is Acts chapter 6, verse 1. Neglect of the widowed. And I can't help but think there had to be a lot of ministry weaknesses prior to that. Never mentioned. With the great influx of these people quickly becoming members of the church, there had to be all kinds of logistical dropped balls, neglect. But the first one that's mentioned, I think, purposefully, is neglect of the widowed. And that wasn't supposed to continue. It was something that was supposed to be addressed. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, though, in regard to the widowed, God says that the first line of ministry to the widowed is not the church, it's the family. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, let me read to you just a few verses. Starting in verse 3, honor widows who are really widows. You know, that phrase, really widows, is kind of offensive when you first read it. You mean I'm not really a widow? Well, he explains. Honor widows who are really widows. But, now here's a contrast. Here's another kind of a widow. One that's not really widowed, in a sense. If any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. Then there's this whole chunk of verses down to verse 16. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. W. Vine, in his expository dictionary of New Testament words, says there seems to be a hint here that in this context, in the first century, there were families who were kind of shelving this off on the church when they should be assuming this responsibility of taking care of their widowed parents and grandparents. Now, how can you take care of somebody when you're clueless about what they're going through? You can't. You need to know what they're going through. That's why in the church, we need to teach about loss, the impact of loss, and especially about the loss of a spouse, and about the experience of life as a widowed person. Because only when the children and grandchildren know what their now widowed parents and grandparents are going through will they be able to effectively minister to them. As a matter of fact, verse 8 is a verse I often lifted out of context and made only a secondary application. Verse 8, the verses prior to verse 8 and the verses after verse 8 are talking about ministering to the widowed. Verse 8 says, but if any does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Many times I quoted that passage, encouraging men to not be lazy, get a job, and support their families. Well, I guess that's a legitimate secondary application. But what's he talking about here in verse 8? In the context, he's talking about widowed parents and grandparents. But if anyone does not provide for his own, widowed parent or grandparent, he's denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Let me tell you about how I neglected my own mother when she was widowed. I'd never read a book about widowhood. I hadn't lost my wife at that point. So whenever my dad died, when she needed help with the checkbook, I was there. I usually gave that job to my wife. But I made sure it was done. When she needed somebody to go with her to the doctor or to go somewhere else, although I lived an hour away, I was there. I cut her lawn during the lawn mowing season, and she had the best looking lawn of anybody on her street. And I was really proud of that because I'm borderline OCD and a recovering control freak. Her lawn looked good, really good. I was proud of that. After my dad died, she had an orthopedic surgery. And she was in rehab, and she was in her private room, and I was sitting with her. I'm going to let you listen to some silence for a moment, and then I'm going to tell you what she said. Now, before I tell you this, I'm the second of 4 boys. The best thing that's said of my mother was she was never in an insane asylum after trying to raise 4 boys. So we're sitting in her private room. Listen to this silence. And it was just like in her room. I wish I would have had a daughter. I never heard her say that before. I never even thought she thought like that. Now, my internal response to that, on that particular occasion, the Lord gifted me with an abundance of self-control, and I did not respond right away. I have a habit of responding too quickly. So inside of me, I'm thinking, Mom, what am I, chopped liver? I'm here. That's kind of the way I was feeling. And I just let some more silence go. It's very unusual for me to be this wise. And then I had a stroke of brilliance, and that doesn't happen very often. I'm going to let you have a few moments of silence, just like I had with her in the room. I'll tell you exactly what I told her, and I meant this sincerely. Mom, I wished you would have had a daughter too. And I meant that. For years in my life, I felt like I'd been gypped. I got stuck with 3 brothers. In a moment, I would have traded those 3 brothers for 1 sister. But I knew what she meant by that. You women are gifted by God to be great caregivers. You are great nurturers. You appreciate relationships better, and you're more gifted at relationships. Now, men can be good at it, but men have to really work at it and work hard at it to become as good as we can be at it. You know what my mother needed more than her checkbook balanced, transportation to a doctor, or her lawn mowed? She needed me. And I didn't realize that until my wife died. And I dealt with the silence in a house and a sense of her absence. Widowed people are social misfits. You know, like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer? You know that cartoon version, that animated version? What was the name of the island where those toys were? Misfit. The island of misfit toys. Widowed people have to realize that they are social misfits in a coupled world. And that's a tough thing to get used to. We need to realize what people are going through in order to help them. What are we going to do to help those people? That's the question we need to raise. What are we going to do to minister to people who are struggling with difficult circumstances? The first thing we need to do is learn about it. You're going to know about it in this last session, right after a brief break. And then we'll know how we can help them. Yes, sir.
What did Ezekiel say in 34:25?
Go ahead and read it good and loud.
Shepherds have fed yourself, have not
Fed yourselves and have not
fed the sheep.
fed the sheep. You know, sometimes we just don't know, we just don't understand what it's like. Dr. Seuss has not been canceled by the Widowhood Workshop Ministry. I think he's right. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. We need to get better at ministering to people who have suffered loss. I'm talking about the loss of their marriage by divorce. I'm talking about the loss of a physical part of their body. I'm talking about a loss of a child to the world, to the devil. I'm talking about the loss of a child by death. We live in a world where people suffer loss. Loss causes us to grieve. We need to understand about grief, and we need to be motivated to participate in helping them. You're going to have some insight into what it's like to be widowed in this last session. Let's take about an 8-minute break at 11:10, according to that clock up there. I'm going to ask you to come back. 8-minute break. It'll be the last session, and we're going to finish at 12:15. This next session is what I consider the most important session in any workshop I've ever done. What's it like to be widowed?